slow progress or no progress, you must go back to that campaign of maximum pressure.
If you really want to tighten the vice or the squeeze on North Korea, it's increasing enforcement on sanctions.
There is a need now for both North Korea and the United States to talk about how to get phased programs.
South Korea's Moon Jae-in government is increasingly willing to press ahead with inter-Korean engagement.
South Korea has a very big role to play here. They can talk to North Korea and talk about what the U.S. is expecting.
Make clear that Washington is not surprised by an announcement that comes out of that summit.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. President Trump warned that the United States could restart joint military exercises with South Korea at any time, adding they will be far bigger than ever before. The president also recently canceled Secretary Pompeo's planned visit to Pyongyang after reportedly receiving hostile letter from a top North Korean official. Was it North Korea's miscalculation to send a belligerent letter? Is the Trump administration now moving to renew pressure on North Korea? We'll discuss all this and more on today's episode. My guest today, Mr. Frank senior expert on North Korea at the United States Institute of Peace. Mr. Served as the senior advisor for North Korea in the Office of the Secretary of Defense from 2010 to 2017. Also joining us today, Mr. Thomas Countryman, chairman of the Board of Directors of the Arms Control Association. Mr. Countryman was a Korea Foreign Service officer for 35 years and served as acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me begin here. If any one of you can take this first question. North Korea reportedly has sent a hostile letter to the United States, and this led to the cancellation of Secretary Pompeo's visit to Pyongyang. Is North Korea showing past practices of threats and stalling tactics again?
You should always expect from Pyongyang threats and stalling tactics. This case is just a little bit different because it does appear that at Singapore, President Trump committed to a declaration that would formally end the Korean War, or at least politically end the Korean War, and appears to have stepped back from that. So I wouldn't defend the North Korean tactics, which can be as belligerent and confrontational as Mr. Trump's tactics. But in this case, they have some justification for feeling like the U.S. side has broken a promise.
What I would add there also is, first of all, I agree with Tom. It's hard to speculate on the letter because we don't know exactly what the content of the letter was. Now, assuming the reports are true that North Korea was disappointed about the U.S. not wanting to sign a peace treaty, well, again, we need to distinguish between an end-of-war declaration and a peace treaty. If North Korea wants the U.S. to sign a peace treaty, then I think that's not reasonable because that's a very long process that will take many years probably to figure out all the clauses and the terms, right? But if North Korea was frustrated that the U.S. was not willing to sign an end-of-war declaration, then I think there is some basis for North Korea feeling frustrated. And so it all sort of depends on what the actual contents of the letter were.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Countryman mentioned about the possibility that President Trump may have made a promise to North Korea to sign a declaration of war in Singapore. Now, this was a reporting which I also saw, but what would have been the circumstances to make such a promise without getting anything from North Korea in return about denuclearization? Why would have President Trump make this promise?
If the report is correct, I'm not surprised that the president made such a negotiating error. I would say it's not irretrievable. There is a need now for both North Korea and the United States to talk about how to get to a phased program, a step-by-step approach to addressing each other's concerns.
Now, President Trump was very adamant about quick denuclearization even before going into the summit. So, Mr. What would have been the circumstance, do you think, in Singapore?
I agree with Tom. I think neither of us were there in the meeting, so it's hard to say with certainty. But I think Trump has a tendency to play hardball before the actual meeting or negotiation, and then when he's there, he tends to back off some of his tough rhetoric. So that could be one scenario where he was talking tough before, but once he was there, he wanted to establish a good relationship with Kim Jong-un. So he was basically said, "Oh, end of war declaration, sure." I also get the sense that President Trump is very much committed to resolving the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. He certainly thinks that would be great for his legacy. He thinks he's the only one who has the negotiation skills and the charisma and the toughness to achieve that sort of outcome. So I think he certainly wanted to present that to Kim Jong-un as a distinct possibility soon after Singapore.
Now, after canceling Secretary Pompeo's trip to Pyongyang, President Trump and Secretary Maris also, all of them mentioned about the possibility of resuming joint military exercises with South Korea. What is the message here?
Yeah, so again, I spent 7 years at DoD. I think it's very simple that initially President Trump suspended the exercises as a confidence-building measure to North Korea to say that this is something that we'll do to get the diplomatic negotiations on track. It's been 2 months, a little over 2 months since Singapore, and we haven't seen significant disarmament steps from North Korea. So this is a message from Secretary Mattis and President Trump to North Korea saying that, we suspended the August Ultra Freedom Guardian exercise, but that's only a one-time deal. There's other major exercises coming up in the spring, and those could be back on track if North Korea doesn't take a significant disarmament action.
And Secretary Mattis is known to be opposed to signing the declaration of the ending of the Korean War. What would be his concerns?
I think his primary concern would be that a political declaration that the war is over, not a peace treaty, but a political declaration, would imply changes to the U.S. military posture in the Republic of Korea, that it would and that it could be used by Pyongyang to argue for a reduction of the U.S. protective presence in South Korea since the war would be over. So I think the Secretary is correct to say that you have to think through all the consequences of such a declaration before actually issuing it.
And Mr. Do you think there is any way that declaration of war can be something less burdensome for the United States?
It could give the basis to Kim Jong-un and China and others for making the argument that you no longer need U.S. troops on the peninsula, and this is sort of a slippery slope argument, and that could lead to undermining of the U.S. posture in not only in the Korean Peninsula but in the Northeast Asian region as well. So I think what we should try to do to make it less frightening, there's sort of a loss aversion bias, not only in D.C. but just anywhere. I think we're more concerned about what we're going to lose rather than the benefits of what we could gain, right? And so to ameliorate that loss aversion bias, I think it'd be helpful for both South Korea, or actually all sides involved, to say exactly what the end of war declaration means. It's non-binding, and it certainly won't mean an end to the armistice agreement, and it won't mean the removal of U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula.
Now, the Trump administration is now hinting about the resumption of the military joint exercises with South Korea. So what would be the tactical advantages of going more stronger on North Korea at this time?
So they made the message about potentially restarting exercises, and that's to hopefully push North Korea to get back on track in terms of disarmament actions. But President Trump also muddled the message because he's also said that the U.S. military exercises with South Korea are provocative, they're costly and wasteful, and so that's not helpful in terms of sending the right message. That being said, I think we're talking about not just the exercises, but also if you're talking about maximum pressure, that's also the enforcement of sanctions, right? And so if you really want to tighten the vice or the screws on North Korea, it's increasing enforcement on sanctions It's increasing the potential secondary sanctions against Chinese entities, Russian entities, and other entities that facilitate North Korean criminal behavior. It would be further isolating North Korea and their diplomatic efforts to raise currency. All of those things are part of the maximum pressure campaign, not just increasing military exercises as well as nuclear strategic assets in the region.
President Trump seems to believe that we got as far as we did to the Singapore summit because of the United States campaign of maximum pressure. And I think he believes that when he sees slow progress or no progress, you must go back to that campaign of maximum pressure. I absolutely agree with Frank. The military threats are less effective than convincing partners around the world, reminding partners around the world that all United Nations sanctions are still in effect, and that Russian and Chinese companies should not be rushing in to do business just on the basis of one summit. They have to respect the continuing sanctions in effect.
My last question before we go, I'd like to hear from both of you. How can you find breakthrough at this time?
That is a $60,000 question, right? It's hard to see how there can be a breakthrough unless, in my opinion, one side or both sides agree to take some sort of risk. So provide a concession that they were unwilling to take previously, right? And maybe it's one side taking the first step, or maybe it's both sides taking a simultaneous an action, right? So I think unless you have something like that, it's very difficult to see a breakthrough.
In this situation where each side is looking for the other to move first, the North Koreans want a declaration of the end of war. The United States wants at least a declaration of the nuclear arsenal of North Korea and steps towards denuclearization. It is very difficult to see a dramatic breakthrough. That is, I don't think that either side is going to blink first. What is required, and this is the very essence of diplomacy, is that the two sides work together, recognize each other's legitimate concerns, and lay out a calendar, a sequence of phase steps that each side takes in order to move us closer without either side being able to say, aha, I have been the smarter negotiator. That's what diplomacy is about, and that does not lead to dramatic breakthroughs. It leads to genuine progress out of the spotlight.
I would add also that South Korea has a very big role to play here. They can talk to North Korea and talk about what the U.S. is expecting. They can also do a better job in terms of public diplomacy with the U.S. For example, I think there's a lot of ambiguity about what an end-of-war declaration means. And also, people tend to confuse that with a peace regime, with a peace treaty. And so only recently did Moon come out and talk about what the 4 elements of an end-of-war declaration is. That should have happened several months ago, and there would have been less confusion, and maybe the U.S. side would be less averse to an end-of-war declaration.
We'll wrap up our first discussion here and watch video for our second topic. There are reportedly rising concerns inside the Trump administration that South Korea's Moon Jae-in government is increasingly willing to press ahead with inter-Korean engagement regardless of U.S. position and a lack of progress in denuclearization. Now, in your observations, do you think the Trump administration is uncomfortable about the pace of South Korea's reconciliation efforts?
I wouldn't say yet uncomfortable. I think they are looking at the pace of North-South discussions and worried that it could lead in a direction that undermines the primary United States goal, which is denuclearization. South Korea shares that goal, but has other goals as well. South Korean diplomacy throughout this year has been exceptionally skillful in getting the two sides to the Singapore summit. I hope and I expect that South Korea will continue to show that level of skilled diplomacy and avoid surprising Washington with any dramatic development.
There are a lot of concerns, and I agree with Tom. And some of the concerns are born out of statements that President Moon has made. So last year, he said that inter-Korean cooperation couldn't move forward unless it's done in parallel with U.S. DPRK negotiations. So we thought, okay, we're on the same page. In President Moon's Liberation Day speech, he said that inter-Korean relations can't be a byproduct of U.S. DPRK negotiations. So now he was sort of asserting that inter-Korean relations could move forward and without being dependent. So I think we see some of that language, and it can spur some concern within Washington. But I feel like a lot of that is underestimating South Korea as an ally. So certainly there's a lot of support, public support in South Korea over the last 8 years. Public support for the alliance has been 90% or above. In the same Liberation Day speech, President Moon talked about turning the U.S. ROC alliance into an even greater one. So I feel like, Tom has experienced this as well, but when we talk about alliance relations in the government, we use terms like shoulder to shoulder, ironclad, no daylight. I think we need to have the courage of our conviction in the alliance and not be so worried about the little sign of deviation.
I think that President Moon and his advisors know that ultimately their security depends far more on a tight alliance with Washington than it depends upon détente with the North. So I agree with Frank. I think they'll continue to do the right balance of their various interests without doing anything to undermine the alliance with the U.S.
South Korean government made an announcement that it will send a special envoy to Pyongyang on September 5th. Now, what will be the concerns on the U.S. side regarding the upcoming round of inter-Korean summit?
I think no surprises is the most important thing. If President Moon intends, or if his representatives are discussing with the North a particular joint declaration of North and South, he needs to talk to Washington and make clear that Washington is not surprised by an announcement that comes out of that summit.
Now, are inter-Korean exchanges a help or a hindrance to denuclearization efforts?
I think they're somewhat helpful. Again, it's because we don't always understand North Korea's motivations. It's always good to hear counsel from our South Korean allies about their interpretations of their meetings, and certainly their understanding of cultural nuances when they meet with North Koreans. At the same time, the nuclear issue really is, at the end of the day, an issue between the U.S. and North Korea. And so South Korea can't really control North Korean behavior or U.S. national security interests, but it can be helpful in providing a different perspective.
That's right.
Well, we'll end it here and move on to our next segment. Okay. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. The photo today is a page on the 2018 Korea Commodities Catalog printed by the North Korean government. We see a North Korean drink here, and on the cover of the bottle, it says, "A drink that boosts energy." Now, Mr. What is your reaction?
It looks like this North Korean person is an athlete. I'm surprised that they're creating energy drinks now. But I think if it helps them in their sporting endeavors, then that's great.
Mr. Countryman?
I'd like to know what's in it. I trust it's not sarin. I trust it's not plutonium. Whether it's caffeine or something else would be interesting.
There is a little bit of a phosphorescent glow in that yellow drink that he
Well, it boosts energy at the end of the day.
Okay.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Mr. Countryman, Mr.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.